Hi, welcome to our webinar today. We are very pleased to be here with Canadians Anti-Semitism Education Foundation and St. Louis Friends of Israel. And thank you all for joining us. We're very fortunate to have an expert here with us today to speak with us about the Ukraine and what's going on over there. But we couldn't do it, of course, without our promotional partners, the Bremen Museum, Augusta Jewish Museum, Congregation B'nai Amona, Nuand Har B'nai Zion, B'nai B'rith International, Atlanta JCRC, Hebrew Order of David International, and the incredible Atlanta Kosher Barbecue Festival, Israel Insight, Jewish Link, Southern Jewish Life, the Atlanta Jewish Connector, and Israel Activist Calendar. I'd love to introduce Stuart from St. Louis Friends of Israel, who is going to come on right now. Fantastic partner of ours. I'm Cheryl Dorchinsky from Atlanta Israel Coalition. And we're also very fortunate, as I said, to be here with Sam Sokol. So Stuart, can you join us?
Yes, I am here. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, I am Stuart Klein from St. Louis Friends of Israel. I would like to, we are very happy to be sponsoring such an important and timely event with all of you today. I want to welcome everyone from all around the United States and as well as our friends in Canada. And we'd like to thank all our sponsors and partners, and a special thanks to Lee and Cheryl for all the work they have done on putting this event together. So Sam Sokol, it's an honor for me to be introducing Sam Sokol today. He is an alumnus of Yeshiva University. Afterwards, he made Aliyah and has been a journalist in in Israel for about 15 years or so, and he's currently writing for Haaretz. And in the past, his work has appeared in the Jerusalem Post, the Forward, the JTA, Times of Israel, Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs, Colombian Journalism Review, and interestingly enough, the Open Democracy Russia. And he was also a reporter for the IBA, or Israel Broadcast Authority. He's also currently a research fellow at the Institute for Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. So Sam is obviously keeping himself very busy and very involved in the very important current events. Sam was the diaspora correspondent for the Jerusalem Post from 2013 and through the last war in Ukraine. In that role, he has a unique and insightful outlook of this current situation from being on the ground in the Ukraine. And we're very, very privileged to have him with us today. Sam received the 2015 B'nai B'rith Diaspora Reporting Award for his work in the Ukraine at that time. As from his experience in the Ukraine, Sam wrote a book, have it right here, Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews. And he is currently working on an update on his book based on the current situation. And obviously this is a work in progress, which hopefully will be out in a few weeks. And I guess I'm going to have to get my new edition of the book then. He was praised for his efforts in this book and endorsed by, among others, U.S. Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism and the chair of the IHRA Committee on Anti-Semitism. One of the praises or endorsement of this book, it mentions that Sam has established himself as an expert on the Ukrainian Revolution and subsequent war and the effect on the country's Jewish community. So with all that, we were very fortunate to have this opportunity to hear from Sam and to learn from his experience on what is going on today in the Ukraine with the Jewish community. And without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Sam Sokol to you.
Sam, thank you again
so
for being
much.
here with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
What is your background with the people of the Ukraine?
So I've been covering Ukraine since 2012, a year before the Euromaidan revolution. I've been on 13 reporting trips all across the country, from Donetsk to Kharkiv to Mariupol, to Kiev repeatedly, Dnipro, Chermalek, Zhytomyr. I've spent hundreds of hours both in Ukraine and in Israel interviewing refugees, soldiers, politicians. And currently I'm helping lead Haaretz's coverage of the crisis from our news desk in Tel Aviv.
And how many Jews would you say are in the Ukraine right now?
Well, prior to the 2014 war, demographers estimated about 70,000. That figure goes up closer to 250,000 if you count people who don't identify as Jewish but are eligible to make Aliyah under the law of return. And between 2014 and 2018, we saw about 30,000 people, about half of them people who identify as Jews by religion, make Aliyah to Ukraine. We've seen a further 10,000 just in the past month. And given the sort of the state of the war currently, it's very hard to estimate how many Jews are actually left in the country. I know plenty of people personally who have fled, and it's a little bit difficult to really know how many. But what we do know is that many Jewish communities are simply gone. The city of Mariupol had a very vibrant Jewish community. I was last in Mariupol almost to the day 7 years ago in 2015. Most of the city is destroyed. The Jewish community of Donetsk, which had to relocate because of the fighting to Kiev, is now again in exile. Most of them are in Romania. It's a disaster.
That's horrible. What was like before all of this for the Jews of the Ukraine?
Well, a lot better than it is now, is the first thing I'll say. But you have to sort of put things in certain perspective, because the Jews in Eastern Europe, and especially in Ukraine, didn't exactly have an easy 20th century. In the beginning of the century, you had a series of pogroms around 1905. Again, at the end of the First World War, with the fight for Ukrainian independence, which did not go very well for the Ukrainians, you had many more pogroms. Then you had communism and the Holocaust and decades more of communism. And then when communism fell in the early 90s, most of the Jews of the country left for Israel and the United States. So what was left was a remnant of a remnant, forcibly Sovietized, with very little Jewish identity. And over the past several decades, you've had different Jewish movements and organizations really working to reestablish Jewish life. You had the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee setting up infrastructure. You had the Chabad Hasidic movement helping to establish communities across the country. Chabad is huge in Ukraine. To a lesser degree, you had the Reform and Conservative movements. You had the International Hillel organization establishing Hillels across the country. And you really had a plethora of independent Jewish religious, cultural, and social organizations. So I'm not going to say it was, pre-Holocaust levels of vibrancy, but it was, things were really moving in a good direction. You saw this really remarkable resurrection of a community that you would think would be dead and gone, and they were really, building something wonderful. And in in 2013, when the president at the time, the Russian-backed President Viktor Yanukovych, decided to pull out of an association agreement with the EU, basically to cut burgeoning ties with the European Union. This led to massive street protests, which probably would have petered out, except for the fact that he sent in members of the riot police to start beating protesters. Things ballooned. You had a massive street movement, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. And when they deposed Yanukovych, the Russians basically felt that they had to defend their interests, so to speak, and decided to use that as an opportunity to annex the Crimean Peninsula and foment a pro-Moscow insurrection in the eastern Donbass region on the Russian border, in the territories of the Donetsk and Lugansk provinces. And this was already worrying for the Jewish community from the beginning, because one of the things that the Russians said when they started taking military action was that they believed that they had to save the Jews and other minorities from what they called a fascist junta in Kiev. And the Jewish community obviously was having none of it. They pushed back very hard to various Jewish leaders. And what we saw was, for 2 or 3 years, a steady stream of propaganda, both from the Kremlin and from Russian government-controlled media outlets, which were most of them in Russia, essentially claiming that the Jews of Ukraine were being oppressed. So the best example I could give was, there was a story that ran in the Russian newspaper Izvestia that members of a far-right group called Pravi Sector were carrying out a pogrom in the port city of Odessa. And I was in Israel. I was between trips to Ukraine. I was flying very frequently back and forth. And I was at a Shabbat meal with someone who happened to be from Russia. And he went, "Did you see the story in Izvestia?" And I go, "No." And after Shabbat, I go online and I look and I see the story. And the next morning I call up someone that I know in Odessa. And I go, "Is there a pogrom?" And I hear him yell out to someone else in the room with him, comes back to me, goes, no pogroms here. What about in Jerusalem?" But this was sort of the thing that they were doing. There was story after story of fake attacks, fake closures of Jewish newspapers, closures of Jewish schools, attacks on Jews. And this went on and on. And the Russians basically turned the Jews into an object of their propaganda. This is very similar to what they're doing now, except it's not specifically about the Jews. Now they're just claiming that there's been a genocide against Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, which is also equally ludicrous. But what was interesting about the reason that they brought the Jews into this was that nobody cared about the Jews. Nobody was being convinced by this, either the Ukrainians or the Russians. The reason this was smart, very ethically problematic, but smart from a propaganda perspective, was that the legacy of the Second World War, that what they call in Russia the Great Patriotic War, is very strong culturally in a way that it just isn't in the West. It's still something that's with Russians to this day. And if you want to tar your opponents as being fascist, the best way to do so, because tarring them as fascist is the fastest shortcut to mobilizing popular opinion against them. Well, the best way to tar them as fascist is to say, well, they're doing what the Nazis did. They're hurting the Jews. So the Jews were sort of instrumentalized, turned into a tool of Russian propaganda. Now, what was ironic about this is the Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. What it did was take these Jewish communities that had reestablished themselves since the fall of communism and essentially make it impossible for them to continue existing. So the Jewish community in Lugansk, for instance, one of the centers of the insurrection, was basically forced to disperse. The Jewish community of Donetsk, likewise, the Rabbi of Donetsk, Pinchas Vyshevsky, led an exodus from the city, bringing as many Jews as possible. They made their way to Mariupol, which anyone who's following the news now knows has basically been destroyed by the Russians. They've shelled it to smithereens. It's basically Mariupol's the new Grozny. But once they got to Mariupol, they were so scared of further separatist advances that they fled, sending some of their people to Dnipro, others to Zhytomyr. Most of them ended up in Kiev. And over the years, I would go back and forth and check in on how this community was doing. And they managed with a lot of trouble to pull themselves together to, first they rented a small house as a synagogue. Eventually they started renting a 3-story building. They had a community center / synagogue with an indoor play area for children, offices, prayer spaces. And it was beautiful. I was there last in the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic shut down international air travel. And I saw how they had rebuilt their lives. And it was really meaningful for me. I had been in the various refugee camps. I remember being in Dnipro at the Jewish center there when the Chabad movement held a mass wedding for people who had been displaced and had their plans put on hold. And it was just so meaningful to see this. And when I see their new community in Kiev in 2020, it's sort of this feeling like, okay, their story is over. That's it. They're moving on. They're not going to be in the news anymore. And while I'm going to care about what happens to them on a personal level, I'll be interested. I don't have to care on a professional level. I don't have to pay attention. I'm going to move on to other stories. And I think that was very sort of naive on my part, because when the Russians started moving on Kiev, the entire community had to leave. Rabbi Vyshevsky led a convoy of dozens of cars with hundreds of people that made its way over the border into Romania. And these people, for the second time in 8 years, are now homeless refugees. And this has been happening to Jewish communities across the country. The Jews are joining the larger Ukrainian population in fleeing. According to estimates, which are already out of date, but from last week already, a quarter of Ukraine's population is displaced internally. So you have about, let's say, 40 million Ukrainians. That means 10 million internally displaced people. You have further more than about 3 or 4 million who've left the country, most of those to Poland, creating, a really bad refugee crisis. Now, what was interesting about the conflict, the first round of the conflict from 2014 to, let's say, 2016, was that while the Russians were lying about what was happening to the Jews of Ukraine, then the Ukrainians were lying about what had happened to the Jews previously, meaning that the Ukrainians really wanted to create a new historical narrative for their country free of Russian influence, to raise up heroes as national heroes, people who had fought the Russians. So what they did is they decided to start honoring members of far-right groups which had fought against the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Groups like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, known as the AUN and the UPA. And the issue with these groups is, yes, they did fight against the Soviets, and they did fight for Ukrainian independence, but they also collectively murdered up to 100,000 ethnic Poles and thousands of Jews. They had collaborated with the Nazis, and they were essentially fascist organizations. Now, the Ukrainians in 2015 passed a bundle of laws known collectively as the Decommunization laws, which enshrined the status of these groups as heroes of Ukraine, where it's now forbidden to denigrate these groups. And the government went on sort of a spree of renaming streets and institutions after the leaders of these groups, people like Roman Shukhevich and Stepan Bandera. And this was something that was also very disturbing to the Jewish community. And it was, but as problematic as it was, the Jewish community also objected to the fact that it was picked up by Russian propaganda as proof that the Jewish community needed to be saved. Because as problematic as this was, one, it didn't really come with a concomitant rise in violence against Jews. And two, it was the same problem that we've been seeing this in Hungary and in Poland and in Latvia and Lithuania. It's a major problem, but it's not a Ukrainian problem. It's a regional problem. So the Russians took this legitimate issue and turned it into an argument that the Jews have to be saved because they're in physical danger. Now, what we saw, interestingly enough, is that in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine. Now, Zelensky is best known as a Jewish comedian who played a history teacher who accidentally becomes president on a sitcom. And most Ukrainians got to know him from his role as a sitcom actor playing the president. And in 2019, people speak about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. 73% of Ukrainians voted for a Jewish comedian to take the reins of power. And among the first moves that Zelensky did were to get rid of the country's powerful interior minister, who did have some ties with far-right groups, and to purge the head of the country's Institute for National Memory, one of the main movers behind the effort to whitewash Nazi collaborationist groups. And in his place, he picked Andrei Drobovich, an educator whose last position was serving on a Holocaust memorial team. So this is the state in Ukraine, the state of affairs in Ukraine, when the Russians then come in and say, Ukraine is run by a group of drug-addled Nazis. So the drug-addled Nazi running Ukraine is a Jewish sitcom star who has taken moves, has made moves to improve the problems that people have with his country's approach to Jewish issues. So it's really, quite ironic the way things have been moving in recent years. And I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that time and again, the Russian claims about what is happening in Ukraine have proven to be false. I'll give one really good example of this, is that when the first Russian troops started coming into Crimea, the head of the local Reform temple was called up by the head of one of the heads of the community and said, "Come to the synagogue right now. There's anti-Semitic graffiti on the doors." And he shows up, and it's the symbol of a far-right group that doesn't have a presence in Crimea. It exists in Ukraine, but Crimea didn't have much of a far-right scene at all. And he sees this and he goes, "This is very suspicious. One, this group doesn't operate here. Two, their logo's been drawn backwards. And three, this happened the day after the Russians came in." So after a few weeks, this rabbi, Misha Kapustin, decides that he doesn't want to live under Russian occupation. So he decides he's gonna leave Ukraine. He's gonna get the hell out of Dodge. And the Russians decided to send a camera crew from the network RT to document his leaving. And for some reason, he decides he's going to let them into his home as he's packing. And they interview him, and they finally air the segment. And they edit it in such a way as, instead of him saying, "I am scared to live under Russian rule, so I'm leaving," they managed to make it look like he's saying, "I'm scared of the Ukrainian far right. I'm getting out of here." And when I spoke to Rabbi Kapustin afterwards, he said, "When I saw this on television, I felt like I needed a psychologist, a rabbi who needs a psychologist, because who can believe that they're going to do this?" And time after time, these things, Russians make claims and it turns out to be untrue. Meanwhile, during the current war, aside from all of the human rights violations, the mass graves they were discovering today in the Kiev suburb of Bucha, which was just liberated, and the destruction of the maternity hospital in Mariupol, you also see the destruction of multiple Jewish sites. So on one of the first days of the war, the Russians sent a rocket to hit Kiev's famous television transmitter tower, which is adjacent to the Babin Yar Holocaust Center. And they didn't hit the center itself, although they did do damage to one building that was intended for use by the memorial, but they were willing to hit something adjacent to one of the, most sacred Jewish cemetery sites in Ukraine. Since then, they've blown up the Hillel house in Kharkiv, damaged the Kharkiv synagogue and Jewish day school with rocket fire, and sent shrapnel through the roof of the local yeshiva dormitory. Luckily, nobody was there. And about a week ago, a Russian artillery strike hit Drobitsky Yar, also a Holocaust massacre site on the outskirts of Kharkiv, damaging a monument in the shape of a menorah, which was left twisted and blackened. So, there's a large disconnect we've been seeing between the Russian rhetoric of, fighting fascists and what's actually happening. Every time they hit a Jewish site, you'll see just a spate of commentators on social media going, well, I guess this is what denazification looks like. You want to denazify Ukraine, you hit the Ukrainian Jews. And it's been very difficult to cover this as a journalist, because this is, it feels like a rerun almost. Like, didn't I cover this, years ago? But it's happening again, and it's incredibly disturbing. What I think I'd like to do, if possible, now is to open up to questions, because there's so much going on. I think
we do
everyone
have
has
a lot
to
of great questions, and we are definitely going to get to all of them. I was hoping to ask you what Israel's involvement's been with all of this from your perspective as a journalist.
That's a great question. Thank you. Israel and Ukraine have had a bit of a contentious relationship over the last few months. Leading up to the invasion, Ukraine really expected more than Israel was willing or able to give. The Ukrainian ambassador to Israel has told me that as a Jew, Zelensky has expected much more from Israel. The problem in terms of relationship Kiev and Jerusalem has been that Israel believes that it has to maintain good relations with Russia, because Russia essentially controls the airspace over Syria, and has come to a tacit agreement with Israel that it'll turn the other way when Israel strikes Iranian targets in Syria. And Jerusalem is very nervous about doing anything that would threaten that. So what has happened is that Israel has been very circumspect in its criticism of Russian actions, to the degree that it has come under harsh fire from the Ukrainians and from Ukrainian Jews. And Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has really tried to position himself as a mediator between the two sides. Now, depending on the day, you'll hear different rhetoric coming out of Kiev. At one point, they were saying that Israeli mediation was more important than the weapons systems that Israel has declined to sell Ukraine. On the other hand, you later had President Zelensky in an address to the Knesset. Zelensky has gone on a spate of addresses addressing different parliaments around the world, and Zelensky was very critical of Israel, saying that the Israelis have to choose. You can't, you have to choose a side between good and evil, is basically the way he put it. So there's been a bit of tension between the two governments. At the same time, a senior aide to Zelensky told me pretty recently that Israeli intelligence is cooperating very closely with Ukrainian intelligence. So, it's sort of hard to parse. Today, what we saw, which sort of typifies the Israeli approach to the conflict, was that they discovered mass graves in the town of Bucha, just west of Kiev, which had recently been liberated. And the Israeli ambassador to Ukraine condemned the killing of civilians as war crimes. But when I contacted the foreign ministry in Jerusalem, they essentially said, no, this is not what we're saying. We're not calling it a war crime. There's real circumspection. There's also been a lot of anger on the Ukrainian side because Israel has declined to take in many non-Jewish Ukrainians seeking refuge. Israel and Ukraine have a visa-free travel regime where people from each country can travel without a visa. And since the beginning of the conflict, Israel has been demanding visas from non-Jewish Ukrainians, has called on non-Jewish Ukrainians to pay up to 10,000 shekels as, can't think of the word in English, I've been here too long, sort of a picadon, sort of like a deposit if they're coming into the country. And that's generated a lot of anger, both among Israelis and among Ukrainians. So it's been very, very complicated and contentious, and we'll have to see how it pans out.
It's very interesting because I had a program with the assistant deputy consul general for the Southeast, and he mentioned that Israel and El Al was picking up, right before things got really bad, tons of people of all religions, backgrounds, etc., and getting them out of there, and that they were going to be taking quite a few Ukrainians into Israel, even though it's a small country, and how much do they actually have to like truly give? I don't know personally. It's just a different perspective, I suppose. And along those lines, somebody asked about the Chabad. It sounds a little similar, that Chabad rabbis in Russia have good relations with Putin. This is a quandary in dealing with the horror of the Ukraine invasion and destruction. Can you comment on that? Like maybe obviously the fact that they're in Russia and they also have a presence in, or had one in Ukraine. How have you seen that dealt with?
So the role of Chabad in Russia has been very interesting because during the last round of fighting, the Russian and the Ukrainian rabbis entered into something of a mini war of their own, with each side lobbing accusations at the other, with Ukrainian rabbis criticizing the Russian rabbis, with Russian rabbis saying that the Ukrainian rabbis should shut up and stay out of politics. But at the same time, the Russian Jewish community was providing material aid and support to Ukrainian Jews. So you had refugee camps for Ukrainian Jews being funded by the same rabbis who were telling the Ukrainian rabbis to keep silent. And now what we've seen is a similar sort of dynamic playing out, where the Russian Jewish community has been saying that it wants to help and support the Ukrainian Jewish community. At the same time, we have seen some Russian Jewish organizations explicitly support the conflict. Recently, one of the two contending chief rabbis of Ukraine, I won't get into all of the politics over there, but there's two rabbis who call themselves chief rabbi. One of the two rabbis, who's chief rabbi, put out a video of himself wrapped in a tallis, holding a Torah scroll in his synagogue in central Kiev, saying that he's not scared to die. He's going to stay to the last minute, and bringing down a curse on any Russian rabbi who doesn't condemn the violence. The following day, the chief rabbi of Russia, Beryl Lazar, who's considered very close to Putin, put out a public statement essentially saying it's forbidden for brother to kill brother. We offer the Jewish community's services to negotiate a peace, which was for a Russian rabbi, a very strong statement. Now, the issue for the Russian rabbis is that they're under a lot of pressure. Multiple sources have told me that government functionaries have explicitly threatened leaders of Jewish communities in Russia, essentially telling them, we'll shut down your communities if you don't back the war publicly. Now, I don't think that the Russians are about to do that because they know how bad it would look. It's not going to go well for them if they do that. It's a propaganda loss, but they're still making the threats. And what one thing we saw recently was last week when the Russian Ministry of Defense tried to claim that the Ukrainians were storing weapons in a synagogue in Uman. The Federation of Jewish Communities in Russia put out a supporting statement calling on all sides to not to take advantage of religious holy sites. So, I think the Russian Jews are under a great deal of pressure, and given everything going on, I'm surprised at how well relatively they've weathered that pressure. You would have expected, given how much pressure the Russians have been putting on religious figures, media figures, etc., you would have expected them to be a lot more, you expected them to endorse what's happening a lot stronger than they have. I'll give you one example I've seen in Russian media is that one official in the Russian Orthodox Church was given a large fine for just using the word war in a sermon on his church website from his local parish. He didn't condemn, it wasn't even condemning so much as just acknowledging that it was a war. The Kremlin has said you have to call it a special military operation rather than a war.
Well, thank you. We have quite a few more questions. I appreciate your taking the time to answer them. One viewer wants to know, you mentioned the strong Jewish organizational support over the last few years in trying to build up the Jewish community in Ukraine. They want to understand why Ukraine? It's not like the Ukraine embraces Judaism or Jews. Why haven't these organizations been trying to get Jews out of there?
Well, I think that's a question that I've heard a lot, and I think there's sort of a misconception at the root of this question, because the majority of Jews have left. You had a massive wave of emigration following the fall of the Soviet Union, and those who are left are the people who won't leave, who feel themselves at home there, who want to stay behind. And it's not a choice of them leaving or them staying. It's whether or not they stay and have a Jewish life or they stay and don't have a Jewish life. Them leaving, short of war, which we now have, was never really in the cards. And I think when I've mentioned this question to people I know in Ukraine, to members of Jewish communities in Ukraine, and I've said, how do you respond to people asking this question? The response has sort of been incredulous. They were incredulous. They were going, well, we can ask the same thing about a Jew in New York or a Jew in London. Why do you stay? It's, that's their home. That's where they live. They love where they are. And, whether or not people agree with whether they should be there, everyone has an opinion, but that's where they want to be. And if Jewish organizations didn't deal with them where they are, there just would be no Jewish life whatsoever.
So an anonymous attendee is asking if you're saying that 200,000 to 350,000 Ukrainian Jews do not want to leave Ukraine.
So, as I said, the numbers are a little bit difficult to parse because, according to demographers, I'm referring here to Sergio Della Pergola at Hebrew University. He's considered the gold standard in Jewish demography within the academic world, estimates that the core Jewish population, people who explicitly identify as Jewish by religion, whether or not they're observant, but their religion is Jewish, was about 70,000 in 2014. The larger figure is people who are eligible to move to Israel under the law of return, but aren't necessarily Jewish or identify as Jewish. Now, many of those are people who are Ukrainian and proud Ukrainians. So again, the overwhelming majority of Jews in Ukraine made Aliyah or moved to the States as soon as they were able to. That's why if you go to Haifa or to Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, you're going to find a lot of people originally from Ukraine.
So how many would you say have made Aliyah or have been basically sheltered by Israel as of now? Do you have any estimates?
During the current conflict now, as of last week, the Jewish, the not the Jewish, sorry, the as of last week, the Aliyah V'Klita Ministry, the Ministry of Immigrant Absorption in Israel, said that 10,000 Ukrainian Jews had come to Israel in about a month. And we add that to about 30,000 that came between 2014 and 2018, half of those being part of that core Jewish population. And the problem now is we can't really say how many Jews are even left in the country, because a quarter of the country is internally displaced, millions more have fled, and it's sort of difficult to tell. I'll give you a good example of this here. Is I was speaking recently to a friend of mine from Kiev, and he had fled with his wife and child to Lviv on the Polish border in the west. He was staying there until his mother, who was in the town of Konotop, could get out, and she had to make her way across the entire country through a war zone. And he's planning on sending his wife and kid and mother to Israel. The problem is that he can't get out because anyone of military age is banned by the Ukrainian authorities from leaving. Men under 60 basically can't emigrate. So you have all of these Ukrainians, women and children leaving, men stuck behind. You don't know how many are going to return after the fact because their husbands, their fathers, their sons are still in Ukraine. It's very hard to keep track of who is where and who's going to end up where. So the whole thing is just a giant mess that we're still sorting out.
People want to know how you know who hit what and why you assume the mass graves are caused by the Russians.
So that's a really good question, actually. I'm glad that was asked. So first of all, a lot of the times with who hit what, you're able to determine that through what's called OSINT, open source intelligence. So first of all, you have journalists on the scene who are able to get photos. You have photos of the explosions, you have photos of the damage, and you have groups like the intelligence collective Bellingcat, which are able to use various techniques and various software programs to take these multiple still photos and be able to extrapolate from that where the fire was coming from, what direction it was coming from. Groups like Bellingcat use software which could tell you which direction the sun was coming from in a photo. They're able to cross-reference things with satellite imagery that comes in from groups like Maxar, and it's a very involved discipline. You also have journalists on the scene who can see things as they happen, and a lot of it is just we don't just take authorities' word for what's happening. Things get vetted and checked and cross-checked between different experts and different media outlets. I get tips all the time, but you speak to eyewitnesses, you check people's credibility, you are able to verify photos in various ways, and it also comes down to whether or not you should. You always check everything, but there's certain sources that sort of lose their credibility over time. So I've seen the Russian defense authorities lie on so many occasions, and Russian media lie on so many occasions that the default position, you check everything, but the default position, generally speaking, is that you don't trust things from certain sources unless you can actively prove it. That's with all sources, but there's varying levels of credibility that come into play. So this is something that I've noticed with the anti-Semitism issues over and over. You check out the claims, you see what sticks, and this is why we have people on the ground. This is why Haaretz has had multiple teams of people on the ground looking at things with their own eyes. Why I'm back in the newsroom, in touch with our people, checking things from my contacts, and it's very much just it's a slog. You get tips in, you check the information, you verify what you can, and if you can't verify it, you don't report it.
Thank you. We have a question. Why hasn't Israel used this incredible opportunity for the aliyah of the Ukrainian Jews, but is forced to accept non-Jewish refugees who have the world to save them? I think what this person's trying to ask is why they're not displaying that they've been trying to save and make aliyah for Ukrainian Jews, and they're criticized and basically condemned for not accepting non-Jewish refugees who have many places to go. From your perspective.
So, I mean, I don't make value judgments. I'm a journalist. I just report what I see. I'll tell you what I have seen is that Israel is working hard to bring anyone who wants to come to Israel. There seems to be a perception among many people that Israel can control the flow of migration. Israel helps people who want to come. Israel tries to convince people to come. Israel can't force people to come. But what we've seen right now is a massive wave. 10,000 people in a month is not nothing. It's very, very significant. And Jewish Agency estimates that we're going to continue seeing this kind of rate for the foreseeable future. So this is a massive, massive wave. And in terms of non-Jewish immigration, the people who are in favor of this are essentially, and which includes several cabinet ministers that I've, including ones that I've spoken to, have basically said, since people are leaving without their husbands, without their fathers, without their sons, the people, a lot of them, people don't want to stay here, and they're coming because they have friends or relatives, people who can help them. If you've seen any video of the refugee camps in Poland and other places, people don't want to be in some mass warehouse kept with other people. They want to be with their friends, their relatives. And so if people want to come for several months, when they're allowed to, because there's a visa-free travel regime, or there was at least, and stay in the interim until they get on their feet, proponents are saying, we want to allow this. On the other hand, you have right-wing groups in Israel who are saying, we don't want Gentiles, we don't want non-Jews. And it's become a bit of a fight. But from what I've seen, most Israelis really sort of lean towards that first view, which is these people need somewhere to go. We went through, one cabinet minister told me explicitly, we went through the Holocaust. There's nobody, was taking us. We have a moral obligation to help people. And it's been an argument here, and it's created a lot of tension between the Ukrainians and the Israelis.
Yeah, I think you sharing your perspective as a journalist is really important. As someone who's dedicated her life to trying to support humanitarian efforts from a nonprofit standpoint, I've noticed, and I'm not saying you, actually, I've seen a lot of your articles and been very impressed with your writing. I absolutely applaud you. Literally, thank you. But there is so much coverage that is just clearly biased against Israel, and it's scary. I saw something in the New York Times, and I don't expect you to comment on this, but it was, all very positive, and then they had to throw one thing in it. We're criticizing Israel for not being criticizing Russia enough. It's like, so you're saying that they criticize them, but that's not enough for you. It's like you're saying that they bring people in, but it's not enough for you. And nobody questions the countries that aren't doing anything to help the situation and are actually making things worse. So thank you.
I mean, I think that's actually just on that one point, that's something that's been, you're seeing actually a lot in the Israeli media itself, that Israelis have been highly critical of their own government as well. Any criticism you see of Israel in the foreign media, you'll see in the Israeli media, because I think the consensus in Israel is we're not above criticism. And I think self-criticism is our national sport.
Yeah, well, I see criticism from
It is a Jewish state.
yeah, exactly. But I see criticism from the international media when I don't see criticism within Israel. It seems to be a constant pastime, and it's definitely not being written by Israelis or Jews in many cases. But
I
getting
couldn't
back on
comment on that
topic,
at all.
somebody would like to know how you see this all playing out over the next 6 months.
Honestly, anybody who says they know how things are going to go is either delusional or lying. A lot of our expectations were confounded when the Ukrainians really were able to stand up and push back against the Russians in a way that most people did not expect. Many people also did not really believe that there would be such a massive incursion. I personally had thought that the Russian forces would focus on expanding their footprint in the Donbass and move down the coast of the Sea of Azov to link up the territories they already hold in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine into one contiguous entity. No, I did not expect at all that they would try to move for Kiev, or that they would do such a bad job of it, that the Ukrainians would do such a good job of on their side that they would be pushed back on that front. So, I think there's too many moving parts really to predict anything, but only time's going to tell what happens.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Those of you who didn't get questions answered, feel free to message me on Facebook. I'll see if we can get some answers for you, or please forgive the fact that we can't be here all day, but we do appreciate you asking and being here with us. So Sam,
Thank you.
how come there's no mega media on the ground war coverage of the Ukraine the way there was in Gaza?
I'm not really sure that I understand the question, honestly, because the media landscape in Ukraine right now, every outfit in the world that can afford to send someone is sending someone. This is dominating the headlines. I don't think it's really useful to try to make comparisons. Often our perception of what gets coverage, what doesn't, is skewed by our own views on specific conflicts. I think honestly that the Ukraine conflict is getting a lot of coverage, deservedly so. This is the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War, and when stuff happens, when we have conflicts in Gaza, it rightfully gets a lot of attention. When there's fighting in Ukraine, it rightfully gets a lot of attention, and I think it deserves that attention. I think the job of journalists is to make sure that when something happens, the eyes of the world are on it, that people know what's happening. It's not up to us to say whether a refugee policy is good or bad, or whether one side or another is right, but it's up to us to point out what is happening, even when it's inconvenient for one side or the other, even if people don't like it, to just give a unbiased, complete picture of what's happening. And I think that there's a lot of journalists doing a very good job of that in Ukraine right now, both native Ukrainian journalists and foreign journalists. You've had multiple journalists killed over the past month, locals and foreigners, including a cameraman from Fox News and multiple other people. And, I think it's hard to criticize the news coverage when people are literally giving their lives to get the story out.
Well, thank you again. Thank you again for being here with us. Thank you all who are watching that taking the time to ask questions and learn with us. Sam, you have a very valuable perspective, and I look forward to reading much more that you write. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I just want to say, Sam, do you want to say a word about your book and the new edition?
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity. In 2019, ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, published my book, Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews. which deals with the Jewish experience during the war. We have a updated edition coming out in about a month, 3 weeks to a month, and this basically, the book deals with my experiences as a journalist on the ground and the experiences of people who lived through the war: soldiers, diplomats, politicians, refugees. And I think, I'm biased about this. In this one area, I will admit to bias, but I think it's good. I think it's really good. So I would honestly recommend reading it if you have further questions, because honestly, we could be here for the next week discussing this. There's a lot going on, but I honestly, if you're interested, I think it's, the reason I wrote the book was because I felt like the stories of the people I was interviewing for the newspaper were going to be forgotten. You write a story in the paper, people read it, the next day they're wrapping their fish in the paper. So I felt like I had to do something to make sure their stories were told. And I would love it if people would be able to read their stories, and this could be something that's not just forgotten the next day.
And you can order that on Amazon, correct?
I just put a link out on the chat.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Sam.
very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. We'd like to thank our sponsors again, St. Louis Friends of Israel, we're the Atlanta Israel Coalition, the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. I've put a link in there asking everyone to please contact and vote yes for HB 1274. That's the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's coming out here in Georgia. Monday, there'll be a vote. So if everybody could share and send, that would be truly appreciated. Sam did put a link to his fascinating book. Again, if you'd like to buy it on Amazon, just click there now and please do. We want to thank our promotional partners again for joining us, and remind you all, if you haven't seen our Land of Israel tours, they're on YouTube. Please take a look at them. We have different areas of Israel that we go through and show you with our wonderful tour guide, David Sussman. We will be planning a live tour with David. So be on the lookout for that, November 6th through the 15th. I'd absolutely love you to join me, and we'll have some more information there. We appreciate all of your support. Feel free again to reach out, to visit us. We couldn't do these wonderful events without the technology, and your donations go to that. So thank you all again who support and contribute. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Stuart. And I look forward to reading your book, Sam, and following the writing. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Have a good day or night,
have
everyone, depending on where you are. Bye.
Well, bye.